guest, David Block, is the ICREA research professor in sociolinguistics in the Departament d'Humanitats at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. And he's also a member of the Academy of the Social Sciences in the UK, a visiting professor at University College London Institute of Education, editor of the book series Language, Society and Political Economy at Routledge, and associate editor of the journal Applied Linguistics Review. And he is currently writing a book entitled Innovations and Challenges in Identity Research for Routledge. And now, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And I don't get to ask questions like, "Can you hear me at the back?" In this sort of situation, but anyway. So I'll just get started. I'd like to start first with one second. I did this. Wait a second. Yes, my plan of action. And what I'll do is I'll talk about some general background, and these are kind of key constructs and epistemological positions, if you like. I'll rush through this somewhat, and there will be slides with quite a bit of text on them. That's more kind of an aid for me. And I'll kind of talk to the slide. I'll try not to sort of read what I've got there, right? But anything that comes up, if you wanted to go back and say, that thing you said about race or that sort of thing, we can do that during the Q&A. I'll then spend some time talking about specific background, and I think there'll be variable knowledge among you with regard to the sociolinguistics of Catalonia and also Barcelona more specifically. I'll be talking about immigration quite a bit, and I've got some statistics I'll be commenting on. Then I'll look at some examples of what is kind of the main focus, which is this kind of complacency around the notion of Spanish exceptionalism, as Spain being uniquely situated as a sort of unracist country and one that has managed to accommodate 6 million immigrants in a short period of time with no fissures and no problems and that sort of thing. So I'm going to be calling into question that. So you have some examples that are entitled the way you see there, and then there'll be some conclusions that I'll come to, okay? And along the way, I'll make a lot of sort of offhand comments, almost inevitably. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborations with a couple of people. Lidia Gallego-Balsà is a former colleague of mine when I was at the Universitat de Lleida until about 1.5 years ago. And she's since moved to another university as well. And she and I were involved in a project that we kind of left hanging, which involved interviewing the children of immigrants who had managed to get into university. And this was a kind of an interesting topic because of the number of immigrants there were in certain areas of Catalonia and Spain as a whole, and the much lower percentage of students that had managed to get into university. Victor Corona is somebody I've been working with for more than a decade, off and on. And he and I have shared, I've drawn quite a bit on his data, working with him in collaboration through a lot of conversations, really, and then written up in 4 joint publications we've had in journals and books. So I'd just like to acknowledge that some of the data I will be looking at is from them and in collaboration with me. Some general background, I suppose it's the very sort of really background to all this. We could think of this as talking about language policy, although really I'll be talking about a lot of other things. And Bernard Spolsky's 3-component model, which a lot of people draw on, could be embellished, but I'll just look at the 3 key parameters of looking at language practices, language ideologies, and management practices. And I think what's interesting about this model is that it does allow for individuals to be sort of practitioners, if you like, of language practice as they go, as language policy and practice as they go through life. So just by the very actions you engage in, you're kind of doing language policy. And I think that's an interesting notion in just about any sort of context where there's a contact between and among languages. The critical approach, which a lot of people would claim, would recognize that language planning and policy making process in the field of LPP itself is ideologically and discursively situated, and it reflects the way that in society we have the reproduction of class, race, language, and power, and oppressions that derive from that. So I think, again, this is just sort of very general background in LPP. A few other constructs I'll look at. One is class, and sort of model that I've developed over the years, which is not particularly original, but it really starts with a Marxist view of the world and moves outward into taking on more social and even sociocultural takes on class, which might come from the work of Bourdieu, but certainly other scholars as well. And so there's kind of material life conditions, economic resources, behavior, the sociocultural realms, sociopolitical life conditions, and spatial conditions, and all of this sort of coming together. I could talk about this for a long time, but if anybody's familiar with my recent work, they will have seen this. And I'll just sort of flag this as something, you know, we could talk about later, but this is a backdrop that I see class as a very important construct. And interrelated with class, I would see race, racism, and sociolinguistics as also key ways of looking at the world. Race looked at in a more kind of social constructivist perspective is not just being about racial phenotype, but also all the discursive constructions around that. Racism seen on the one hand as simply an attitude or action or institutional structure which subordinates persons or groups because of their color, but also moving outwards, looking more at what's known as cultural racism, and Gross-Fogel providing a very helpful definition there, politically, culturally, and economically produced, if you like. The ratio-linguistic perspective that's come in, you know, to research in recent years, Rosa and Flores outlining it in the following way, seeks to understand the interplay of language and race, if you like. It's interesting in this definition also they talk about the nation state colonial governmentality, because I will be talking about Spain later in terms of having been a colonial country, which perhaps has not gone through a sufficient amount of sort of decolonizing thinking, if you like, in society at large. And I'll come back to that later. Other epistemological framing we could look at are notions such as aversive racism, which is a kind of earlier version of what's known as racial microaggressions, which has been used more recently. But we have this in terms of the kind of the little things do count for something, and particularly when they're cumulative, and particularly when they might seem innocent on the one hand, so somebody just says something in passing and doesn't mean anything by it. But again, over someone's lifetime, this builds up, if you like. And I'll come back to this later with a couple of examples. Counter stories is a construct coming out of critical race theory, but looking at stories that are told by people on the receiving end of, say, racial microaggressions, and taking into account these stories in research. And these counter perhaps official narratives, or indeed erasing narratives. So narratives that do not acknowledge certain things going on that could be considered racist. Intersectionality has now become somewhat of a buzzword and perhaps even overused, but seeing it intersectionality as a theory of oppression, and recognizing what should have all along been a very obvious point, but that we can't just look at oppression in terms of one dimension. And particularly in the early work leading up to what became known as intersectionality, we have this confluence of an interest in, you have feminism, particularly Black feminism, coming together with an interest in class and with sorry, I've got lost here. Yeah, okay. But anyway, you have here this social inequality being multi-dimensional, if you like, right? So around race, gender, and class. So we go on to specific background, and here I'll kind of slow down just a little bit. I'll come back to the theoretical stuff if somebody wants to talk about it later, but I thought I would sort of get through that quickly. I'd like to provide some background. Some of you will be familiar with this, some of you won't, and so we'll just go through it anyway. Changing demographics in Catalonia, situating Catalonia. Here you have the map with France there, Spain, and Catalonia being in, situated in the northeast part of Spain, if you like. Now, what's really interesting, and particularly for me anyway, because I moved to Barcelona in 1979, actually late 1978, and the Barcelona I lived in for a long time was it was interesting being a bilingual community with Spanish and Catalan, but was fairly monoracial, if you like, monoethnic really, and you know, very little immigration. I don't have the stats before 2000 in this chart, but they were very meager. I mean, if in 2000 the percentage was 2.9% of the population of Catalonia was considered immigrant, it would have been well below 0.5% at the time I first came here, like 40 plus years ago. Interestingly, if you look at the top, you can see the figures, the population of Catalonia in 2020, and the population considered foreign, which is what you see. It's in Catalan because these charts are all from the Catalan a sort of center of Catalan demographic data. And you have the percentages on the right. So you have quite a high percentage there, 16.2. It's also gone up, which is kind of interesting, between 2018 and 2020, quite a bit. The highest figure previously was 2010, but you can see if you just sort of go up from the bottom, how quickly and rapidly this happened. And of course, in Spain as a whole, we were looking at 5.5 million immigrants coming in at the same time. So you've got again, a country that was not receiving immigrants 30 years ago, and in a question of maybe 20 years, it just had this massive increase. You know, it began in the 1990s, but really accelerated right at the turn of the century. Now, as far as where people are from, again, the names of the countries are in Catalan, but I think you'll work out what they are, even if you don't know any Romance languages. But you have Morocco at the top, Moroccans, and you have going down the list, and I've color-coded these as kind of the members of the EU are in orange, and that indicates we should bear in mind that people from those countries, it's kind of difficult to get figures because you could go across the border and start living somewhere and you wouldn't have to register, right? When I lived in London, and at that time the UK was still in the EU, you had a massive number of French people, for example, and the official figures were like 1/5 of the real number. So again, this is, you take these figures with a grain of salt, really. The rest of the figures in green, you have countries of Latin America. Kind of surprising that Honduras should be so high. But one thing I was looking at today is some statistics for people from Ecuador. Ecuador traditionally in Spain as a whole has been the largest immigrant group from Latin America. And what's going on is people are becoming Spanish nationals, and the statistics don't really reflect that. So it's kind of hard to say when they say a foreign community, they're talking about the people who don't have nationality. So in fact, that means that Catalonia is that much more diverse, if you like, than the statistics would indicate. So it's kind of difficult to know exactly what the numbers are, but certainly Colombia there could be much higher if we consider people who were Colombian as recently as 5 years ago, but have become Spanish citizens. In Ecuador in particular, that figure at one time was double that and more in Catalonia, but yet it's gone down and people have stayed. So it's not that there's been a return movement. Now, as far as Catalan goes, a lot has been written about Catalan. In terms of policy and planning research, I kind of identify 3 strands that seem to be dominant. If you look at stuff coming out of the last 3 decades in particular. One kind of focuses on language and identity, the Catalan language and one's sense of self being Catalan. So the key kind of, as a national identity, it's so important to have Catalan language, so that they seem to go together, if you like. You could compare that with the case of Ireland, for example, where you don't have that strong link, or not nearly as strong a link, if you like. Language attitudes, Catalan is a prestige language. Is it a useful language? These are the key questions that come through. And certainly a lot of the efforts that have been made have been to make Catalan a prestige language and a useful language. I'll come back to that in a moment, how successful that's been. And language use, what percentage of the population uses Catalan? I know people who are obsessed with this and constantly conducting surveys. And, you know, who speaks Catalan, who do they speak it with, and where do they speak it? And, you know, and in a sense, it's kind of an idea that any kind of social encounter where Catalan's not used is almost like a lost opportunity for the language, that somehow it damages the language. There is something in that, but again, you kind of wonder sometimes if that's really what it's all about. More things I'll come back to. These things come up later as well. As far as a revival and success, if you look at the bottom, there's a quote from Jackie Orla, and she kind of restates something that was written for a long time about the kind of success story that was the return of Catalan and bringing it back. Certainly after Franco died in 1975, and certainly by the late 70s. My son was born in 1983. He was part of the first generation, have all his schooling in Catalan, except for 2 hours a week in Spanish language. And so from the time he was going to nursery, everything in Catalan, then he went into school. And so again, this is a kind of a reality through the school system of Catalanizing people, if you like, which has been successful and probably was looking more successful 20 years ago. And the way that immigration has panned out and the way that immigrant children have come in and the way they have settled into Catalan society has somewhat upset that. But this is not to say, you know, it's their fault. which I think some people kind of see that. The immigrants come in, they don't learn Catalan, and they don't want to speak it. But I'll come back to why that might be the case and later on in the talk. But we have this thing about the different laws that have been passed, if you like. And certainly from 1980 to the present, there's an extended presence of Catalan in the media, politics, education, and sports, although there are a few chinks in the armor, if you like, with regard to whether this has been a complete success. Now, the efforts to promote the learning and use of Catalan, if you like, you go through from 1982, you started having campaigns, and they've all been about how can we get people to speak Catalan who might be able to speak it, but they're reluctant to speak it, or for whatever the reason they choose not to speak it. And so you can see these are all in Catalan, but I've got the translations in English. I remember 1982 because they used the figure on the right, and they created a little girl named Norma. And of course, the Norma was the normalization of Catalan. And so that was a big thing for a while. But you see as it goes through, you have things like it depends on you, you are a teacher, then kind of being more colloquial, wind up Catalan, spread Catalan. Then you have looking at Catalan in particular contexts. So it kind of gets divided up into different domains of activity. Then we have 2013, somewhat less imaginative in a way, Catalan, the European language. And then the more recent one, and this has been off and on really, is the idea of having volunteers, and people try to set up situations where they can encourage people to speak in Catalan or something, have a coffee and speak in Catalan. That's not sure how that works actually, but whatever the case, you can see this kind of concern that kind of cuts through a lot of sectors of society, particularly the official people behind the official language policy. And I kind of sense that Catalan is always in danger, if you like. And interestingly, I mean, more recently, there's been some pessimism coming through. I think people have been involved in this for a long time because there does seem to be kind of a sort of stagnation as far as the progress Catalan might make in becoming fully used. Not to convert the area into a monolingual society, Catalan-speaking society, not that at all, but the fact that a lot of progress that was made initially in the first 15 years, say, maybe in the last 15 years has sort of slowed down quite a bit. You can see this in the competence, what people say their competence is, and that has gone up since 1981. And although the figure in 1981 for understanding was quite high considering what you were coming from. Again, this is self-reported data, so I've always been very skeptical about it. But whatever the case, you have speaking, reading, and writing. If you consider that the education system is exclusively in Catalan, then that figure for writing at the bottom is not that encouraging, really. But that's more discouraging, not just for Catalan, but sort of the general idea of literacy, if you like, in society, if you think of written literacy. The reading and speaking, okay, fine. And there are lots of reasons why it's not 100% for speaking and why it's not 90%. But whatever the case, there has been success, but it never quite gets complete, if you like. And I suppose the understanding, because people might watch football in Catalan on television, and so they can understand that. And they come into contact with Catalan, but maybe they never speak it, kind of thing. Now, the children of immigrants to Catalonia, again, these are children arriving, as you've seen in Barcelona, what you've seen in many urban areas around the world in recent years. So you have very large flows of people coming in, and coming in at different ages, which is very important. So when you talk about children of immigrants, you could be talking about somebody who's born in Catalonia or in Spain, or somebody who came at the age of 5 or the age of 10 or whatever. And a lot of this could be important with regard to the kind of relationship the person has with language. And kind of to capture that relationship, there are two general models. There are lots of models, really, but there are two that kind of overlap. I think Park and Wee were thinking about Rampton when they put theirs together. But Rampton's original one was about, we could see people's relationship with language in terms of their expertise in the language, their affiliation to the language, and inheritance refers to whether the language is maybe a home language. They're kind of born into the language, if you like. And Rampton was looking at immigration to the UK, and in particular in London. So if he was looking at the children of Gujarati-speaking people who came from Kenya and Africa, or they could come directly from India, what was the status of Gujarati for these children, right? So you might find that the expertise was very low, the affiliation was not that much, sort of a cultural idea of Gujarati being important. And the inheritance was there completely, in a sense, because they might hear Gujarati in the home. And so you just kind of spread that out of different languages spoken at home in immigrant families, if you like. And so Park and We is very similar, although slightly different, focus on allegiance, if you like, competence, which is similar to expertise. And then this idea of authenticity, which I think is an interesting addition, because this idea of being recognized as a speaker. And in many parts of the world, there is a notion of looking like a speaker of a language, which becomes very important. And if you don't look like a speaker of the language, then you're racialized, if you like, and you are shut out. You know, no matter if you're speaking the language, people don't hear it. And you couldn't possibly speak this language because you don't look like a speaker of it. As far as Catalan among immigrants, I mean, the factors that might contribute to somebody feeling a strong affiliation to Catalan, apart from expertise they might have, and despite the fact that they haven't inherited the language, but that they might feel a sense of authenticity in the language, would be if they arrived at an early age, long-term uninterrupted residence, growing up in a two-parent family, at least one parent is Spanish or Western European citizen, parents with high education credentials and professional status, high education expectations of household, achieving good grades, associated with middle-class Catalans. And that last one's important because in a way, a lot of the features mentioned previously point to a middle-class status. And this is one thing that's very important, is that Catalan is very much a middle-class language, if you like, if that makes sense. And indeed, if I will mention the independence movement in Catalonia, and it's very much a middle-class movement, which is in some sense both a strength for it, but also a weakness. As far as the language ecology in Barcelona goes, I'm not sure this kind of, the way I put these arrows here really represents anything, but we have this kind of interaction between Catalan and Spanish, or Castellano, as spoken in Spain. And then you have English exists as kind of in the tourist trade and also as an international community. And then languages of immigration, which in a sense are kind of erased, not really looked at certainly not in the official curriculum. And it just doesn't seem to be kind of time for that, because the battle really is to keep Catalan going, if you like. I mean, there are obviously lots of other things going on here, but in a sense, I get the impression sometimes people say, not now, we're busy with this sort of thing. So again, I think you can look at people's profiles, if you like, and in my case, I actually happen to come to this, if you look at on the left-hand side and then Castellano on the right. So I work in these three languages regularly. But what I have a sense of is that in a bilingual community, there are people I say would be preference in one language or the other, Spanish or Catalan. And so very early when I started living here, I got into Catalan. And so this has become my preferred language. And so I will speak Spanish, but only where it's necessary. So I will start any conversation in Catalan until it's proven that won't work, and then go into Spanish. So people can push me into a switch of language by answering me in Spanish. And if that goes on for one or two turns, then I'll go into Catalan. That's pretty standard here, I think. There are people who will stick to Catalan thinking, even though you're speaking Spanish, you will understand me. But it seems like a kind of the basic knee-jerk reaction of most people without thinking about it would be, once somebody's speaking to you in Spanish, if you speak Spanish, you just speak it, and that's it. You don't start saying, I have to defend the language. But there are people who will sort of take a stronger defense for keeping Catalan going in a conversation like that. Bilingual conversations, by the way, are perfectly possible. My mother-in-law and my father-in-law regularly engaged in them. I remember when I first met them and being at a table, and the family in general speaking Catalan, but the father was a Spanish speaker. So they would speak, he would speak in Spanish and everybody spoke in Catalan. So again, this is, it's very fluid, if you like. Class in Catalan, you have being a regular user of Catalan correlates strongly being a member of the owner, entrepreneur, wage earner. And I mentioned this thing about being in the middle class and upper middle class as a minority pattern. Those classified as working class. That's a bit overstated, but I'm basing this actually on the studies that you see here at the bottom. And then as immigrants tend to occupy the lower end of the job markets, they behave, and I put this kind of in italics, they behave like working class Catalans traditionally, which is sort of seen as Spanish is spoken by working class people and Catalan by middle class people. That doesn't hold up 100%, but there is a strong element of that, right? And it was the case 30 years ago, and it's the case today, right? Spanish exceptionalism. Now, this is something I came across in the literature in looking at immigration. There's an interesting book by Alejandro Portes and company. This was a combination of Portes and his group working out of the United States and then researchers in Spain. They were applying some of Portes's frameworks about the way, I like his notions like segmented migration, the way people go into particular job sectors. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in Portes's work. But I found the leaning towards this Spanish exceptionalism that if you look at the quote at the bottom, this is by a scholar named Arango, a Spanish scholar, and he's talking about how immigration boom experienced during the 2000s was not accompanied by a surge in public concern. And the migration issue I've marked here in bold, the migration issue has not been politicized to any significant degree. There are no populist xenophobic right-wing parties that take anti-immigrant positions at the national or regional level, with the exception of a very small party. This party he mentions here doesn't even exist anymore and really was really a very negligible presence. However, there is by now, and I'm coming to this, a very significant party now that is taking this anti-immigrant stance in a very, very explicit way. Why, as you know, Arango's argument being that Spain was exceptional, he lists these three reasons. The manifestation of anti-immigrant attitudes are restrained by culture norms. So there was something kind of against it, kind of in the social psyche, if you like, in general. Groups favorable to immigration are large and active, so there are support groups. And just on the whole, kind of a general discourse against racism and xenophobia, if you like. Now, I would agree with this to an extent. I think there has been that. I think that has been in play. And a lot of people are constantly reminded that Spain at one point was, that people were emigrating from Spain to Northern Europe, and that you know, people knew about experiences of being the other, being the outsider coming in and being racialized actually by Northern Europeans, and that it wasn't a very good experience. And so people are constantly reminded, you know, we should know better than to be racist because we had this experience in our history. By now, I think a lot of the kind of links to that experience are becoming more and more distant for people living in Spain today. And then the final one, that immigrants are entitled to the same endowment rights. Okay, so yes and no. Okay, I would say to this. There is a complacency, I think, going on, and this is taken from a study of the people from Ecuador. I mentioned that Ecuadorian immigrants were like the largest group at one point, well, largest group from Latin America anyway. And you know, this says the Ecuadorian immigrant survey do not feel discriminated against by the indigenous population. This was the response of 74% of the interviewees. Only 25% report having suffered some form of discrimination. I have a couple of things to say about that. First of all, who is asking what questions to whom under what circumstances? And I think, you know, this is an elementary question for any kind of research taking place. So I just imagine if the researcher, in this case, González Enriquez, if he's, you know, a white Spanish person, and he's talking to a person of color from a country, and well, from Ecuador, for example, what's the person going to say? Do you feel like Spanish people discriminate against you? Are you then going to? You could say yes, I do, but you might say I don't want to get into this with you, and just not say anything. So again, I thought that was a bit disingenuous. And the second thing is that 25% is not a high number for this kind of phenomenon. There are 25% who were recognized having said they had problems, so that would be worth looking at. I mentioned earlier the appearance of a sort of classic, you know, fascist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic party, and this has occurred very recently. The party was founded in 2013 when Arango published what I mentioned earlier when he said there were no xenophobic parties, but of course he was probably writing that a couple of years before 2013. But certainly the party wasn't, I remember 2013 when it was formed, and it wasn't anything really. It was just a few disgruntled members of the Spanish Conservative Party, the Partido Popular. But it was really from 2018 that their presence was suddenly felt. And it really is very much an excision of the Partido Popular, which means it's just like a section. It's like if you had an orange and you took out about a quarter of it, you know, you just took out those pieces and just took them somewhere else. And that's really in its origins. And even to this day, if you look at the voters, the vast majority of the voters would have voted before for the Partido Popular, and now they're voting for Vox. So Vox is very different from other xenophobic. The xenophobic parties across Europe, by the way, are very different. You go country to country, and the histories and the socio-cultural, socio-economic, all the context surrounding them is actually quite different. And I think there's actually not enough picking apart. It doesn't help that they communicate with each other. For example, Marine Le Pen in France showing support for Vox. But in fact, they're very different parties, because the economic policy of her party in France is not against the social welfare state, for example, and it's certainly not a liberal party in economic terms. Whereas Vox comes out and says, we are a liberal party, meaning classical economic liberalism, the free market and all that. So again, these things are very different, and they're really just, what I would argue is that these people have always been there. They've always, roughly getting up to 15% of the vote, as you see in recent polls. They've always been there, but they voted for the Partido Popular, which perhaps did a service to Spanish society, was kind of keeping them under control, because a lot of these people, they'd be very vocal, but they didn't seem to have an overwhelming influence within the party and its policy. So while the party is very conservative and very right-wing, and had elements of what I would call national Catholicism, which is kind of the ideology of Franco, it very often didn't go too far, for example. So in power, they haven't tried to overthrow same-sex marriage laws, and a fairly progressive abortion law they went after, but only in the end, tweaked it a little bit and changed a few things. So this kind of more conservative agenda, social agenda, has been pushed. And so I think a lot of these people were sick of this and they left the party. They also now are able to freely express their xenophobic views, which maybe they felt like they couldn't before. Watch this space, because this party is said to be growing in the polls. I'd like to move on to examples. And one thing I like to talk about is what I call the post-colonial legacy, which seems to exist very strongly in Spain, and although it's not really acknowledged by most people. And that's one of the things about things I'm talking about. If I talk about racism or anything, these things in the general population are not acknowledged. There's a great deal of sensitivity to taking on board that maybe this is a sort of act of colonialism, or maybe this is an act of racism, right? And I think when I talked about complacency earlier, that's what I see going on, okay? Paulo Casado is a leader of the, Partido got knocked over behind his picture anyway, the Partido Popular, the Conservative Party. I could talk about him for a long time, but I won't. So he's a young leader, roughly late 30s, maybe 40 by now. I'd like to talk about his speech on what's known as the Dia de la Hispanidad. So it's like, the Day of Hispanicity on the 12th of October, 2018. And the backdrop of this was the sort of rising Spanish nationalism. So Spanish nationalism is always there, as are, most nationalisms around, but more in banal form and more in a kind of latent form. But certainly the kind of the push from Catalonia, in terms of the sovereignty movement, has sort of brought to the surface more overt manifestations of Spanish nationalism, in my view, quite extreme ones, even though a lot of people don't acknowledge that. So against that backdrop, he's speaking, and this is part of the speech. This is what he said. So if we look at, I have it in Spanish, and here's the translation in English, but he says, we celebrate, I believe, the most important milestone of humanity, in my opinion, probably only comparable to Romanization. So this is like the biggest thing that ever happened. La Hispanidad is probably not only Spain's most brilliant period, but man's, and he makes a kind of face, along with, and with I repeat, along with I repeat, and he swirls his arms upward, with the Roman Empire. Why? Because man had never before managed to spread, and he cites with his fingers, culture, history, religion, history of a nation to so many places at the same time. Sometimes we're not conscious of how a millennial people in a centennial nation has done so much for all humanity, more than any other country. If you think about it, you can say that a new world was discovered by them, that the three ships managed to change the history of the world forever. And above all, what other nation apart from Spain can maintain these cultural, historical, linguistic links with practically a third of the world? Well, I can think of a couple, but anyway. Another example of this kind of colonial attitude, and this is a really bizarre example. This is Josep Borrell, who's actually a member of the Spanish Socialist Party. He's a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he's currently the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, a post he took up after having made these comments in 2018. I don't think they were paying attention. But in English on the right, he was asked by a student giving a talk at the Complutense University in Madrid, and he said, Why does the United States have a great level of integration? First, everyone has the same language. And second, because they have very little history behind them. They were born in independence practically without history. The only thing they had to do was kill 4 Indians. But apart from this, it was very easy. Now, when this went viral actually, and he had to kind of backtrack and say, yes, that was the stupid thing to say. I was speaking off the cuff. I was trying to be ironic or whatever, you know. But there it is, you know. So in my view, this is kind of these examples come through, these kind of comments, and again, it goes back to what we were talking about, microaggressions, if you like. Microaggressions directed at nowhere, if you like, almost in some cases, but they do show a kind of complacency with regard to no self-questioning of this kind of colonial legacy, and the idea that the colonial legacy of Spain was a good thing for Latin America. There's just no doubt about it. That this seems to be the kind of general view. Obviously not the view of everybody, and particularly people on the political left. It isn't the view, but again. Now, one of the weirdest examples I've seen of a kind of this kind of a denial, if you like, that something might be racist took place in 2008. And the Spanish national basketball team, which was quite good at the time, several players from the NBA, such as Pau Gasol and Juan Calderon, I think his name is Juan, but Calderon played for Toronto. You know, these were all players on the team. And in a sense, you know, the ones that have been playing in the NBA, there was thinking they should have known better, but whatever the case. Apparently they were taking the photograph and somebody said, do something Chinese. And it nothing else occurred to these players but to make their eyes, you know, flat like this. So then this went viral, and it was actually published in, I think it was published in the New York Times. It was published in The Guardian in the UK. And then there was a whole, I should have copied all of this because it's since disappeared, but there was a forum around this. There were people in chats, you know, going on about it. And what I noticed was just about all the people who were posting from Spain were taking a very defensive attitude, saying, this is not racist. This is just, someone said, this is just stupid, but it's not racist, and everything else. And I remember getting into an argument with somebody about it, saying that I thought it was racist. And they said, why? And I just gave a very simple reason, lots of reasons why. But I said, one simple reason would be, imagine a child who is Chinese parents, he goes to school, and this comes out and everybody sees it. So the next day he goes to school, what do the other kids do? They go up to him and start doing this. So it has an effect, if you like. And this is what I was trying to say, is that, you know, this could be seen as a racist act, if you like. Now, the statement you have here has been translated, although it probably was published in English, but I think I translated from Spanish. And it talks about, you know, it's kind of what the federation, the Spanish National Basketball Federation, this was their statement, you know. So, you know, as fortunately, the vast majority of the Spanish International Public understood is corroborated by the Embassy of the People's Republic of Spain. The only meaning of the gesture is affection, sympathy, and recognition, which is what this federation feels for Chinese people in their country. So basically, it's a show of affection to do that. Now, it's quite interesting because, again, they did this thing where they went to, you know, you imagine them going to the embassy and saying, showing them this, is this racist? Is this racist? And then the people say, what is that? You know, I mean, so apparently the reaction of some people in China would have been, what on earth are they doing, kind of thing. So again, this is, you know, on one level you could say it's stupid or whatever, but certainly there are racial overtones, and yet there's kind of a tendency to kind of sweep it away. Now, on television, there have also been examples of things, and there's Pepe Reina, who's a goalkeeper, and at the time this commercial was made, he was still playing for the Spanish national team, and he was still active, playing for clubs. He made these commercials with this insurance company called Grupama Seguros. And you can see on the right, it's too bad I'm not playing these for you because, well, I didn't want to get into technological problems, so I'm not being very daring here, but there is a link here. If you look this up, if you type his name in Grupama, you'll get the video. But basically, this is a classic where you have the Africans who are speaking a language that doesn't exist, so it's kind of unga bunga. and they apparently, there's subtitles in Spanish of what they're saying, you know, so they're welcoming him, and then he realizes that he's going to be cooked for dinner. And what all the commercials have in common is that he ends up in a risky situation. At the end, he says, I feel safe. You know, it's kind of the slogan, if you like. So some of the other ones have nothing to do with racialized situations, but this one certainly does. And it plays on a stereotype and you know, even cinematic images, if you like. The second one is Colacao, a drink. And this one is bizarre because you have the man you see, the figure you see here, his afro is actually down inside the cup. So you see the cup in his afro, and then it starts moving up, and then his face appears and he smiles. So again, this has also caused quite a bit of discussion. And there are other examples of food products like that. The other one is the Machu Picchu, and Machu Picchu is actually a racial epithet in Spain for people from Latin America, people in South America in particular, and so you know, particular physical appearance, if you like. And this was the name given to this character in this comedy series called Ida. And the actor himself was actually not from, he was supposed to be from Ecuador, but they called him Machu Picchu. It's kind of interesting. And then, but he wasn't from Latin America. He was born in Tokyo, and he was the son of a Spanish woman and a Japanese man, right? And so he played the dummy, basically, always doing things wrong. And you see the main, all this took place in a bar, and so you can see the main figure there yelling at him all the time. This actor, I can't remember his name now, but he later said that he regretted having played this part, because looking back, he could sort of see that it just got to be silly, really, just the same old joke, you know, using this this particular character. Now, I'm going to shift now to a very much a sociolinguistic example of what I would consider, and am I inflating things here by calling this a ratiolinguistic microaggression? It's certainly a ratiolinguistic phenomenon. I'm calling it a microaggression because it has a cumulative effect, which I mentioned earlier, over time. And I'll explain that in a moment. It has to do with what I said earlier about racial profiling. Who looks like a speaker of a language? Now, Catalan occupies a very, as is probably clear by now, a very kind of interesting and varied position in Catalan society. But very much it's an insider language, and it's very much identified, as I said earlier, with Catalan identity. And there seems to be certain mechanisms that Catalan speakers have used for some time, because this quote here is from a book by the sociolinguist Lluís Aracil. And what he writes about here is something that I noticed when I started living in Barcelona, and very soon afterwards, within a year, I started trying to learn Catalan. And so I tried to speak Catalan on the streets. And I would, at that time, I'd stuck out, having kind of a Northern European appearance, but being tall, I stuck out from the rest of the population. So people would identify me as a foreigner looking at me, I think. By now, things are much more diverse, right? But whatever the case, I would constantly be in situations where, or just short encounters where I was speaking in Catalan, and I think by a certain time, a plausible enough Catalan. It wasn't that every word took, 50 seconds or something. And yet people would hear me and they would speak back to me in Spanish. Or they might say, oh, you speak Catalan, but they would say it in Spanish, and then they would just move in. Now I'm talking about people who I'd heard speaking in Catalan, so I knew they probably were Catalan preference speakers, this term that I mentioned earlier. So they would normally speak in Catalan, but in my presence, they wouldn't. And they wouldn't allow me in, so to speak. And so this is something that Aracil is commenting on. Now you kind of fast forward to today's time, and you end up, this becomes much more, it was racialized in my sense, if you like, but I'll say I'm white and I can take care of myself. And I think that what was at stake in that regard, and in my particular case, it wasn't such a slight, if you like, that it destroyed my sense of self and all this sort of thing, right? I just found it kind of irritating, and it went away after a while. This is the other thing. And certainly by now, I mean, I don't know, I don't think it's happened in a long time that I've been in a situation where somebody tried to force Spanish on me, so to speak, if you like, in a situation where we would have spoken in Catalan. So again, this is a very compelling story. This was this is based on the interviews with Lidia Gallego. This was actually carried out by Lidia Gallego. And it's sort of a life story interview. And the person she interviewed, the people chose names, and she said, Chow, call me Chow, whatever. And it was written this way. But anyway, what she talks about her whole life. She was born in a village near Lleida, which is west of Barcelona. So she was born in kind of a rural area. She was born in an area with no other Chinese immigrants. And she grew up with Catalan as her main language, if you like. And she felt very identified with Catalan. So what she says here, and I'll read it in English, Spanish is not like a language for me. It doesn't mean anything to me because I feel more me in Catalan. It makes me uncomfortable because I go to the supermarket and they tell you how much, you know, so dino amb 80, so that means, you know, that means 1820, right? And she says, sorry, dino 1920, it says in Catalan, and then to me they say in Spanish, right, the same price. And I go, and she makes a face, you know, and when you go to ask somebody something, you know, excuse me, and she asks in Catalan, you know, where do I need to leave this? Like she's in the post office or something, where do I put this? And the person answers her in Spanish, you know, oh, over there, kind of thing. And you know she speaks Catalan because before she was speaking it. So I answer in Catalan again, and she replies again in Spanish. So to me, no, that makes me feel a little, you know, she makes a face. So I say, but why? I don't know, so we're foreigners, right? So again, this is, I think, a very compelling story, and she seemed genuinely hurt by this when she was telling us this. And at the time, she was maybe 19. And so this is something she lived very close and just kind of thought, why me? Other stories told similar such things. There was one informant who was from Morocco, and she wore a headscarf, and so she was constantly, she talks about a situation where these two people are speaking in Catalan about her right in front of her until she says to them in Catalan something, and then they look shocked, you know, kind of thing. So you kind of wonder, what do people imagine? You look a certain way, you can't possibly speak the language. And the other thing is, again, it's almost like people don't seem to realize that the education system is in Catalan. So if you see a child, you see an adolescent, and they're going to school, they're living here, chances are they're gonna understand Catalan. Obviously, they're gonna speak it. Whether they choose to speak it or not is another issue. And the whole thing about choice comes down to, if you over time are constantly spoken to in Spanish, and this is another thing that's come through, that people say, well, people always speak to me in Spanish, so I've actually got used to speaking in Spanish as my main social language. And so in school, everything's in Catalan, and I'll do that. And I remember Victor's research, Victor Corona, his research was on the children of Latin American immigrants. And he, you know, he was classifying them as Latinos, and he was saying that basically that he would notice that they would have all their notes from school written in Catalan. But if you talk to them, they would express no interest in ever speaking Catalan. That in their social circles, they never used it, sort of thing. And I'll mention that in the end as kind of a form of resistance. This is, oh, sorry, I forgot I had this slide, sorry about that. This is actually an example of what I'm talking about. So this is Victor, sorry, and he's interviewing these five guys from Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia. And so he just asked them, you know, what they think of Catalan, because this was a question he asked her. His research was taking place in secondary school, kids roughly 14 or 15. And this was like 2008, 2009. So he's asking them, he's trying to get at why they always speak to each other in Spanish, and yet they're in school in Catalan all the time. So, you know, what's going on here? So he asked them, and they basically, some of the translations could be questionable because translating some things is difficult. But anyway, let's say they say the equivalent, it sucks, and I don't even know why they came here. So he switches. If you look at Alex, he's gone from talking about Catalan, and then he switches to why the fucking Spanish had to come over here and take our money. I hate them. I hate Spanish. So he doesn't make a distinction saying, oh, the Catalans are Spanish. No, he's just going to say Spanish. And he said, why don't you like them? Because they came over here to fuck us over, just over there. And he goes Columbus, and it brings in everything. And I guess he came over to conquer America, and they took our money, they took everything. Now this is interesting because I put it as a form of resistance, because there's a resistance to Catalan which morphs into a certain resistance about maybe the way history is being told. And these kids would be in history classes. So how is the Spanish colonial period presented in history classes? And a very insightful comment came from another informant that Victor worked with named Carlos, and this was in 2006. At this time, Carlos was older. He wasn't in school, but he was somebody Victor met. So he was in his early 20s at the time. But he was somebody who, in kind of early adolescence, had come over to live in Barcelona from his home country. And he was from Ecuador, I think. And so he says, they teach us from the time the Spanish arrived, the conquer, they tell us the whole story, and here they don't know it. Why don't they know it? They were the ones who went over there. It's because they don't want to know. So I said to the guys, but did you learn this in Ecuador? And he's talking about guys that, like him, who were the children of Latin American immigrants. But here they don't teach, they don't teach you, you understand, they teach you a history different from what they taught us before. Right? Now, if we go back to the comment about Pablo Casado that I mentioned earlier, when he was talking about the Hispanidad and other parts of the speech, he talks about this kind of brotherhood, I think is the term he used. And you know, everything's cool, you know, everybody loves everybody, and you know, we Spanish, we love you Latin Americans, and you love us and everything. And so there's it's just kind of brushing everything aside and not really taking on from any kind of critical perspective, if you like, what might be going on. Now, there are some very interesting emergent voices, people who are writing about, particularly about racism in Spain. There's Desiree Bella Lovede, and she's from Catalonia, she's a Catalan woman, and she has a book out, which is Being a Black Woman in Spain. Najat El-Lachmi is a very successful Catalan author, and she's written on different occasions. There's one of her books that I found very interesting was I'm Also Catalan, and she, in the book, relates episodes like the one I mentioned earlier, where the switch takes place, where she's talking to somebody and they won't speak to her in Catalan. Or there's one where she phones somebody about a job, and they speak in Catalan, and then she shows up, and the person says, "Oh, it's you, right," and then tells her the job's been taken. You know, once she sees her, you know. And Lucia Mavomia is a journalist and also an activist, and she's written books about, actually a couple of novels about the immigrant experience. Chinta Tsai, with the very interesting name you can see there, is a hip hop artist and also sort of an activist. And Ruben Bermudez is very interesting because he grew up in a village in Extremadura. I haven't seen any reference to his African heritage, if you like. But he has written quite a bit, and one of the questions you see behind him is a book that it's actually a photographic, a photo show that he put together, which was called Why Are You Black, or Why Are You So Black? And this was apparently a question he was asked when he was growing up. And so right now he kind of moves around. Lucia Mavomi actually is on YouTube giving lectures. You can also find Desiree Bella as well. And El-Lachmi also, she has quite a bit of a media presence. So these are kind of voices that are producing, if we like, counter stories, but kind of bring to the fore things that maybe people assume are not problematic, if you like, in Spanish society. Concluding comments: the Spanish exceptionalism is a reality. Then why do children of immigrants tell the stories they tell? I mean, if they're really the case, then why do we get stories like the ones we get when we interview people? There's a need to abandon the complacency. There's of exceptionalism, the condescending colonial mentality that persists, and the feeling of superiority towards immigrants in general. And there is kind of a poor thing kind of element. People see, if somebody, you know, people see people coming in on boats, very desperate conditions, say in the south of Spain, and they see this on television, and very often the expression used in Catalan is pobrets, and the poor little things, right? And so again, this is kind of a condescending attitude here, which people maybe need to think about. Also, the cost of racialized microaggressions more broadly, how people are sort of unseduced by what's around them. So over time, if you never spoke, in the case of the Catalan society, if you're never spoken to in Catalan, then you feel a certain separation from that. And this comes out in some of the interviews that I've seen that Victor carried out, and also Lydia. The need for more public dialogue. I mentioned earlier, there are now some voices coming out. The need for a critical examination of how history is taught, a need for engagement with Spanish nationalism and not just Catalan and Basque nationalism, because there's an idea that there's only Spanish patriotism, but Catalan and Basque have nationalism. And so I think that's another thing that maybe needs to be looked at. I think the speech I showed from Pablo Casado earlier, again, there's no doubt in my mind that this is a nationalistic speech. You know. Some relevant publications with Victor, we've had a couple of things. We were playing around with intersectionality for a while, and then we've got more recently an article in Language Policy and also one in International Journal of Bilingual Education. Those deal with some of the things I've been talking about today more directly. And I've got another article that was kind of somewhat of a survey piece in a special issue on Catalan sociolinguistics, which was in Language, Culture, and Curriculum there at the bottom. Thank you very much, and I'll stop there. Hello?
Thank you. Yes, we're here. We're just, I think people are silently clapping.
Okay, I'll stop the screen share, yeah. Okay, and now I come back. I told you I feel like when I'm presenting, I'm in a hole, I'm just by myself, and all I see is the screen, but anyway.
So we have some time for questions. If you have a question, I ask that you use the raise hand function, or you can go in the chat and you can either type out your question in the chat or just say that you have a question, and then we can call on you. So I see one in the chat already. Ariana, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Ariana Hernandez Rewand, Barcelona native and anthropologist at Tulane University. I was wondering if you could place this in sort of the long durée of this phenomenon, which, you know, came to me also, you know, first because I grew up in 1970s Barcelona, and then because you mentioned the issue of class, about how now it's the middle and upper classes that speak Catalan, and not speaking Catalan is associated with working class people. But as you know, in the, you know, I guess in my parents' generation and in the 70s, it was the other way around. The Barcelona upper and middle classes, all the way to people like the founders of the Avui newspaper, spoke Spanish, right? And then the phenomenon that we saw in the late 70s, and then with La Norma and so on, was that, you know, learning Catalan was a way for working class people to sort of integrate themselves and erase these differences. But there were many conversations that it was the other way around. I had many conversations with people that, you know, like I grew up seeing them as like these immigrants from southern Spain, that they were speaking to me in a Catalan with an accent, whereas, you know, my cousins and I were speaking Spanish, right? Because that's what we grew up with, you know, like the upper middle class Catalan families, you know, they made sure that the children would not have a Catalan accent in the 60s. And this also links to, you know, to the immigration and to the racism that there was and through the 70s towards immigrants from somewhere else in Spain. So what happened to this now? So, you know, so many immigrants that they had, you know, they had populated the Extra Radio of Barcelona, then they learned Catalan, they made sure the children were, you know, learning Catalan with no Spanish accent. What's their role now toward immigrants from other countries?
Yeah. Okay, I'll go back. You said a lot of things, actually quite interesting, and things I maybe should have mentioned. I mean, my view of the class issue with regard to Catalan would be slightly different from what you said, in that I've always seen a bifurcation of the real elites, if you like, in Catalan society. So a kind of Spanish-speaking elite and a Catalan-speaking elite. And the Catalan-speaking elite would have been the people coming down through, would have been in the governing party Convergencia y Unió for a long time, and they would have they would have kept Catalan going, you know, through the years of Franco. And this is reflected in the university, because I know people roughly my age, so people who were born in the 1950s, and when they went to university, one case I can think of a person, both their parents from outside Catalonia, so kind of a typical story. They moved to Catalonia for work reasons, and she was born and raised in Barcelona in a Spanish-speaking environment. And she told me that it was the age of 18 when she first came in contact with Catalan, and this was before the death of Franco, right? So everything was in Spanish, but when she went to university, Catalan was used among the students. And again, where were the students from? Most of the students were not like her, from working class backgrounds. They were from middle class backgrounds. So I think that it was kept alive. And my wife has a similar sort of experience, really, although she was a Catalan speaker at home. She grew up in a bilingual household, and also it was when she went to university where Catalan was used fairly regularly among the students. So I think that there is a case to be made that there was a Catalan-speaking part of the upper middle class and the elites of Barcelona, and there was obviously the Spanish-speaking one. What's interesting by now is that people in that, there are certain parts of the city, as you know, that are associated with that class of people. And by now, though, I think Catalan has made a lot of inroads in what was formerly the Spanish-speaking end of the elites. Would now be more Catalan-speaking than it was before, although not completely. There would be people who might resist taking on Catalan, but it's a mixed bag. It's very difficult to know what I'm saying in a way. We'd have to really go into detail and hit the streets and really talk to people a lot. But the accent thing you mentioned, I wanted to say one thing I have noticed is going back to the generation of people more or less my age, they made a great effort not to speak Spanish with a Catalan accent. So when I first came here, the Spanish that was spoken would have been, for anybody from Madrid or another part of Spain, yes, they had a Catalan accent, but it was far less marked than now. And if I think about my son, for example, so my son could speak Spanish perfectly well, but he has a very, very strong Catalan accent. I have a very strong Catalan accent when I speak Spanish. And this has become kind of the norm. And you see this on television. You'll see academics or journalists on television from Catalonia, and they're on Spanish television, and they have very, very strong Catalan, whereas I think going back 40 years ago, they wouldn't have. So that's kind of a victory for Catalan language in a sense, because it's this mark, if you like, has become much, much greater as far as having this accent, if you like. As far as the racism towards immigrants, I mean, yes, I mean, we've had the whole, we had what was in a form of racism, a form of xenophobia, in fact, with regard to people from the south of Spain, in particular, coming into Catalonia in the 1950s and 60s by people who were already settled here. But then over a generation, you have people settling in, and by now you have, the interesting thing you said, there are people from working class Spanish-speaking background who made it into university and become, and I know several people who are now in their 30s, 40s, and they kind of represent that generation of people, and they're they're Catalan preference speakers. They've shifted completely to Catalan. The other thing you didn't mention was the whole thing about the independence movement and the association with being middle class and the association with being Catalan preference speaker. And you can find, lots of statistics on that, based on questionnaires as to how people are situated. But as far as the reception of immigrants in Barcelona in particular, I think it's, I can't remember, did you ask that if there was what the response of working class people is?
No, I guess that, I was wondering if, back then there was, I don't know if call it xenophobia or sort of like a negative attitude toward immigrants that had come from other parts of Spain, and that in a way they were responsible for this Spanishization of Barcelona, right? Then through the 80s, some of them became more Catalan and Catalaners than anybody else. Really más papistas que el Papa in some ways. And so how is that, with the xenophobia against immigrants from other parts, particularly Northern Africa and Africans. And so, in other words, the Catalonia-born people, those differences have disappeared in how they deal with immigrants from other countries.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, in a way, you could argue that the shift has come. A lot of what might be qualified as racism is total indifference. It's sort of totally ignoring people, and that's what I find. There's kind of an erasure of immigration from any kind of public debate, and you can see this in. It's kind of interesting that if you look at the Catalan independence movement, I said the weakness and strength was where there's a very middle class movement. It's also there just aren't that many immigrant faces in the movement, and even in politics, there are only a few examples of people come forward. Who would be considered people of color, who are from immigrant backgrounds, and this is but this also applies to working class people in general in terms of the independence movement. So there's kind of Barcelona, it's difficult to have complete segregation because everybody lives close together, and there isn't kind of a ghettoization. There are only a couple of areas with very high concentrations of particular groups. So people live kind of, you know, what used to the old expression, cheek by jowl. You know, people are living next to each other, and but there's a lot of social segregation, and you see this among different groups. And Victor Corona is originally from Mexico, and it's quite funny some of his experiences because he spent some time doing kind of informal research, hanging out with people from the Dominican Republic. And he was telling me about how, you know, the groups of friends go to the same clubs, and the only people there are Dominicanos, right? And so there's kind of this social segregation going on. And there are people, you know, who work as, you know, people from Ecuador and from Colombia and from other countries who might work as cleaners. And so their contact with kind of autochthonous population, for lack of a better word, is through, you know, these are the people paying them a salary to clean. But they don't have any friends who, you know, they don't associate. They only associate with people possibly who are from the same nationality background, everything. So there's a lot of segregation like that going on that nobody really thinks about. And so the idea is that there's no problem. And I'm just wondering if in the long run, we get a generation along, we might start encountering some problems, if you like. And that would be my concern, you know. So I'm not, you know, I've had conversations with people and they say, oh, you're saying everybody's racist here. Well, no, I'm not. Let's not get it. Let's not look at it that way. But I think there's a complacency that people are not really addressing this kind of segregation that goes on, which, you know, maybe in the long run, nothing, I don't know. You never know how societies evolve, right? Those things can go a lot of different directions. But I do think there's potentially a problem, a big problem here. And it has to do with sort of true integration, if you like, and true kind of forming of taking on board the fact that we're living in a much more diverse society than was the case 20 years ago, as recently as 20 years ago. Yeah. Sorry, that was my speech. That was kind of so.
We have a few hands up, so we'll go with Michael first, then Jillian, and then Ophelia. But Michael can go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. I could say a lot, but I'm going to limit it a lot. I'll say two things in response to this. First of all, I think that the Catalan middle class and the Spanish working class is very ideological here. That the demographics are less important than the fact that people make these associations. It's just widely thought of as Catalan is the middle class language, for better or for worse. Now, I think where you see the question of segregation here is in the school choice. There's a very open school choice in Catalonia, and people will, I mean, I have family members who've done this. They will avoid a school that's associated with immigrants and Roma. There's a large Roma population. So I could say a lot more, but I'm going to leave it. But thanks for it's been really great talk.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned the schools thing, because that's another thing where I've had a few arguments with people, because the system here is, there's a state system, and there are private schools, and then there's an intermediate category, which are schools that were completely private. They reach an agreement, they go along with the official curriculum as established by the state, and they, in exchange, they get funding. So they don't have to charge very high fees to parents. And these have become the way for middle-class families that might be lower middle class. They might not be, wealthy middle class, they're not upper middle class families, but they're families that if they had to pay full fees for a private school would probably not be able to do it, but they are able to do it because of the subsidies. And these subsidies have been maintained. This happens all over Spain, by the way. And so what you get is a very much a segregating system, because most of the immigrants coming in could be classified as at the lower end of the economic scale, if you like. And so they end up they have to go to state schools, if you like. And as Michael was saying, we see this phenomenon that has been seen in many, many parts of the world, where the schools become immigrant schools. And I've seen this. I mean, I saw this even before I lived in London for 16 years, and I came back to Barcelona in 2012. And I think about 10 years ago, I was visiting, and I saw two groups of kids within a span of 10 minutes from two different schools. So these little kids, like 6 or 7 years old, on a school outing, right? And one school, all of the kids, you had kids that were Chinese, North African, Sub-Saharan African, all these different faces, and very few kind of European, white faces there. And in the other school, kids I saw, they were all white. And they also, you could tell, that was probably a private school or a semi-private school, you see, and the other one was a state school. And so you do have this segregation. And this is another thing that people are not addressing, I think, is that this segregation that's going on will have consequences in the long run. And this is it's a problem. There's also the issue of the teachers in the schools, how they see these situations as well, which is a whole other topic to kind of go into, I think. But thanks for mentioning that, because it's another kind of angle on the whole sort of dynamics of race relations, if you like, and also in general sort of attitudes about what might or might not be problematic.
Jillian?
Yeah, hi, thank you for this talk, David. It's super interesting. I wonder if, I feel like in a way you're talking about the construction of a problem, right? Like how are immigrants being constructed as a problem or not? And I know from my own experiences doing work in Italy that their immigrants are constructed as a particular kind of problem. And I know that one of the sites that happens, both deliberately and not, is around pedagogy in terms of language learning, Italian language learning.
Yeah.
So it's both a place where people who are very anti-immigrant point to, they're ruining our schools, these kids, they need all these resources, but also teachers and people who work on language pedagogies are also kind of really hard at work trying to figure out how to Italianize these kids. And I wonder if there's the same kind of like action in pedagogical circles to like constructing this problem. And I can't help but like, I don't know how this is related, but I can't help but not think about your like the 25% of people who didn't say they hadn't had.
I think
that's really important, isn't it? Like that's a pretty high number. So the construction of this problem seems to, like, some people are obviously recognizing racism and their experiences, right? But there's a mainstream, obviously, that isn't constructing it in the same kind of way. So,
I found that that's what I found striking about that study. That 25% was brushed off as insignificant. I kind of thought, well, actually, it's not. What's going on there? As far as I'm not really the best person to ask because I'm not that connected with schools research and that sort of thing. And a lot of stuff I'd done through Victor was doing the work in the schools. But I have anecdotal evidence, if you like, if that counts for anything, and also a few things I've read. My general impression would be that the same kind of thinking about what's going on here that you found in Italy would be very similar in the sense that it's a problem to have these kids in class. And I have a person, actually a person I used to see socially a long time ago, like 25, 30 years ago. I haven't seen her in ages, but I remember I did run into her maybe a few years ago. We were walking and talking kind of thing, and she's in a school, and she was presenting it all as a problem. Everything to do with the immigrant children was a problem for her. What Michael said, the parents will vote with their feet. They just basically will. It's the almost commonsensical argument. Obviously, these kids are going to hold up the class because they don't speak the language, and they're going to hold things up. So I'm not putting my kid in that situation. So anybody who can, in a way, ends up. They can't. Not anybody. I should mention there seems to be a core of people who they go to neighborhood schools sort of no matter what. They're not put off by this. In fact, they have a particular social and political consciousness and go through this. But there will be a lot of parents who will say, yeah, obviously there'll be language problems. And so the teachers themselves are doing the best they can. Now, this is a civil service system which is fairly rigid in the sense that you get a position at a school, you can ask for a transfer, but you need to accumulate points, which could come simply with years of experience. And I need to look for this more, but I've done some searches on occasion, but I wonder about research that would look at what percentage of teachers are really totally unhappy with being in these schools? They don't have a sense of vocation being in them. When I lived in London, what I found was schools that were considered problematic in some way. They could have had all kinds, discipline issues. They could have had all kinds of problems. People chose to go to the schools and work in them. So there was kind of a vocation. I'm working in this school. They might have called it a challenging school, although in the past it would have been called a rough school, say. But whatever the terminology that's used, they were deliberately and very self-consciously and consciously going into these schools because they thought they wanted to make a difference. And they had this kind of vocational sense of what teaching was about. The Civil Service Corps, on the other hand, could have in them inculcated that this is their duty. On the other hand, at the same time, they might take the attitude, look, I'm getting out of here as soon as I can because this is it's just making my life difficult. And the teacher I mentioned earlier said this to me. She said, before immigration, I found it so easy to teach. And this is one reason why I went into teaching, because I like it, but I also wanted an easy job. And now I've got problems, and so, this is like I said, this is one person, but I've run across a few examples like that, and through other researchers, mention of this sort of thing. You can see it coming through in research that might be about classroom interaction, but you might kind of look very carefully at the kind of questions and the kind of way that the teacher's acting and that kind of thing. But I suspect that yeah, there's quite a bit of that kind of, this is a problem. Because it wasn't that way in recent, if somebody's old enough, they would have remembered a time when their big problem was Spanish-speaking kids, Spanish-speaking households, getting them to speak Catalan. That was the extent of their problem. And now there may be a lot of other things going on as far as the adaptation of the children go. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, okay.
Ophelia? You're muted, Ophelia.
Thank you, David, for this talk. I was really struck and interested in the quote you gave us of the three young men who really could not differentiate between the Catalans and the Spaniards, right? I mean, he really, and that's the type of reaction that I would have of maybe some Latin Americans here in New York City that are not familiar with Barcelona at all or Catalonia, and they don't understand the difference. So, but I mean, it's amazing that this happens when you're living within Catalonia. So I'm wondering if you could comment on maybe is this a failure of the closeness of the Catalan school system that cannot help students differentiate between the Catalan context and then Spanish context?
Well, it could be shorthand terminology in a sense, but I think it's Adriana Patiño has very interesting research going back. I mean, she's been involved in several different projects over the last, more than a decade. And I remember about 10 years ago talking to her, and there was a thing about, she was doing work with Colombian shopkeepers near the Sagrada Familia. So people were dealing a lot with tourists, and they were, and she told me that when they talked about themselves, they only associated with Colombians and possibly maybe a few other people from other Latin American countries. But they didn't really have contact. They couldn't cite anybody they really thought they knew very well who was, considered was Spanish, right? And for them, it didn't matter that the language wasn't the issue. It's that these are the Spanish people. I'm coming into the former colonizer, basically. I'm living here. This is Spain. And so I think that comment, I suppose with that comment, if Victor had stopped him and say, you're saying Spanish, what do you mean Catalan, whatever. I mean, I think as far as, because there's not a racial difference here going on. And indeed, even we could get into customs and the way people act and everything, how different are these, I could get into trouble saying certain things, but is there really a great deal of difference in certain lifestyle things and everything across Spain, particularly in urban areas? And there are lots of things like that could identify people as being pretty much the same. Yeah, they speak Catalan and they make us go to school and learn Catalan, but if you take that away, they're still Spanish. And I would read it more like that. And And also we have to look at the performance side. You know, they're talking to Victor, and Victor at that time was probably about 12 years older than them, but he had a very youthful appearance. And that was a great benefit in his research, because also he was into the same kind of music they were into and all that kind of thing. And so he established links with these kids, which kept up, because 10 years later, he was able to reconnect with them, as any good anthropologist does. You go back to the scene of the original crime, so to speak, and you end up, you know, doing follow-up work. And he's done that with a few of the kids he was in contact with, going back, say, 14 years ago. But he found it interesting because he himself had kind of converted to Catalan. He came here and very quickly learned Catalan, so he was interested in their attitude. But I think if he, if he'd broken it down, he could have said, yeah, okay, we're in Catalonia, they're Catalans. And I think they would have been very aware of that. But for them, in a way, it was kind of a comment about, it's still Spain. These people, they were part of the same package. And of course, you know, there's a lot going on in recent times looking at, you know, who benefited from the slave trade, for example, right? And it's not as simple as saying you can put it all in one city, you know, or something like that. You know, the economies, a lot of things. So the Catalan economy would have benefited from the slave trade, even if maybe it wasn't so directly involved. And certainly from, if we look at Mallorca, look at the Balearic Islands, a lot of people from the Balearic Islands migrated to the Caribbean. If you look at the number of Catalan surnames in the Caribbean, it's quite interesting. So again, to kind of, you know, if somebody wanted to say the Catalans weren't involved in the colonization, this gets kind of this is interesting look at history. You know, we could go into this in detail, but whatever the case, I think these kids are probably, in some sense, performing with Victor because, you know, they liked him and they said, oh, you know, we can say what we want to say. But on the other hand, there seemed to be something, not just in that conversation, but other ones coming through, this kind of resistance kind of thing, saying, you know, I'm not going to play along with these Spanish people kind of thing.
Yeah. So it is getting close to 3:30, which 3:30 New York time is later for David. And so I want to be respectful of your time, David. There are 2 hands up. Do you want to do?
Okay. Yeah,
okay.
I'll do that. Yeah.
So we'll do 2 more questions and then I think that will be it.
Okay.
So, well, Michael, you just took your hand down. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I know. I mean, and it's funny. So
you're muted.
I was going to let Kit's iPad go first.
Okay.
Because I've already talked.
All right. Go ahead, Kit's iPad.
All right, unmute. Yeah, thank you, Michael. Hi. I'm sorry that I'm an iPad. We got a bad connection here, and there's 2 of us Zooming on different Zooms. So thank you, David, and very interesting talk. Lots of points to pursue. Probably this is, you know, perseveration that's not necessary, but following up on Ophelia's question about how can this be, and your response, which I think was very good. And I agree that the performance factor was probably really significant there in talking to Victor. But I just want to comment that this lack of awareness or disinclination to distinguish between Spanish and Catalan, particularly among young people who have been in schools and all, it makes an interesting comment on the Hispanist, the centralist, Españolista complaint that what Catalan schooling is brainwashing against, right, against the center, against Castile, right? That all they teach in Catalan schools is that, you know, the Castilians are the oppressors and Spain is terrible and blah, 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 blah. So this is interesting that apparently this would suggest that that's not the message that they're getting in school. So I just wondered if you know, just to recognize that. And
it's funny because what you just said, I said to somebody once who was talking about the indoctrination theory.
Right.
You know, it's related to the independence movement, but also Catalan language. And you do get in the Spanish press sometimes the impression that, you know, Spanish speakers are being run down in the street and shot, or that if you go to Barcelona, you can't speak in Spanish, which is so ridiculous. I mean, it's just not the case. And so but the indoctrination thing I find very interesting through the language and also what it might mean in terms of being in favor of independence, because you know, one of the things about the independence movement is that if indoctrination were so complete, how do you explain that in polls, roughly half the population says they're not in favor of independence or something like that, you know. So if indoctrination, those are smart ones, you know, those are the ones who were so clever they couldn't be indoctrinated, and the other ones are the indoctrinated souls. So none of these arguments of indoctrination make any sense. And certainly, like you said, I agree. I mean, if you know, it's amazing, you know, amazing in some sense, the lack of loyalty to Catalan, if that's the word, that some people might have, but obviously the mitigating factors are social exclusion and everything else. And so a form of resistance that they know maybe bothers the teacher or other people would be to resist speaking in Catalan. And this might then form part of an identity that develops over time, and it becomes actually the preferred language of the person, you know. So these things, it's more complicated than that, but I mean, these things kind of evolve in that way. But Victor was constantly coming back to that because he was intrigued by it when he was doing his interviews, because when he was doing field work, so he was spending time in classrooms and everything else. And but yeah, I mean, you know, anybody who's looked at a lot of the research coming out of Catalan from classrooms, you can see there are teachers. I saw some data in a publication by Eva Cudó and Adriana Patiño, where the Catalan teacher was speaking in Spanish. I thought that was bizarre. I mean, so the person thinking Catalan language and literature, it was actually going off into Spanish, you know, doing the switch, so to speak, you know, of using Spanish with the kids in the classroom setting, which in a way is a violation of the responsibility of the teacher. They should be, particularly if you're teaching Catalan, you should be doing the class in, you know, using Catalan as a medium of instruction. So, so yeah, I mean, all these stories about, you know, excluding Spanish, and as you know, I mean, statistically, Catalan kids are about in the middle of the table when it comes to Spanish proficiency when they finish school, which is actually quite amazing considering that the studies are, you know, the medium of instruction is Catalan. So there's a lot of Spanish around. There's a television, there's media and everything, and so people end up learning it and becoming literate in it. So yeah, I just find it funny, but it's an ongoing thing. You'll hear, you know, even a week ago I heard somebody say something along those lines about, you know, Spanish being marginalized and all that kind of. It is, in terms of being a language in the education system, fine, but there's a reason for that. But apart from that, you know, it's not like you can't speak Spanish here.
Thank you.
I like that kid's iPad because it reminds me, everybody would have seen the I'm Not a Cat episode, which I have to say, I don't think, for some reason I laughed. I was falling out of my chair laughing. I had to watch it about 3 or 4 times. So I'll admit that.
I'm sorry, I have too many different machines here in the house, so I can't control their identities.
No, I think it's good. No, it's fine.
I think we all understand. Michael, do you want to ask your question?
I kind of forgot it with kids, but I just wanted to I guess I just wanted to add that indeed I've experienced this switch a lot, and I'm never sure if it's because of my second language Catalan or because of my appearance, because I'm racialized here very often as Moroccan. People will assume I'm Moroccan, which is which it took me a while to figure that one out, what was happening. But there's another comment that I would also want to make, is that this erasure of ethnicity is fairly common in Europe. It's not just here, and it's not just, it's not just, and that's the reason why the statistics are so difficult to deal with, is because ideologically, once you've nationalized as Spanish, you're no longer Colombian or whatever, you know. But of course that isn't the way people respond to people. It's very hard for someone. I mean, I'm one of the interviewees that I had. I remember I asked him something, but he said, "Oh, I was born here. I'm Spanish." He's Moroccan. His parents were Moroccan, and then he just laughed because, of course, he wasn't Spanish.
Yeah, but you know, I think the switch thing I feel very strongly about, because there was a period in my life when it irritated me. But the other thing is, I just find it. I mean, I'm constantly, not constantly, but you know, from time to time, I know people who do this, and I say, "Why did you speak to him in Spanish? there's nothing wrong with speaking to the person in Spanish, but they haven't given the person a chance to speak in Catalan.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about people who spend most of their life speaking in Catalan. I mean, they just don't know, they don't choose to speak in Spanish ever. And yet they see somebody in front of them, they see a black face or a Chinese face, or, you know, and they don't realize they're doing it. And I've had people say they don't even realize they've done it. Oh, was I speaking in Spanish? You know, kind of thing. And so it's kind of it's interesting. And I find that I sort of deliberately don't do that. I just make a point. And sometimes you run into situations where the person doesn't want to speak Catalan or doesn't feel comfortable and they speak in Spanish, fine. But other times they do. So there's nothing, you know, because I know that these people, I know these people have been living here. They have a greater, you know, they have a claim to being Spanish citizens in many cases. They were born. I mean, why, you know, why is there assumption that they wouldn't speak Catalan? It just seems, doesn't make, but the assumption is really not conscious. It's just kind of it's a knee-jerk reaction. But where does that knee-jerk reaction come from? And it's kind of this othering, you know, this sort of subtle, not so subtle maybe, assumption that these people won't know how to speak the language. This exists in other languages, by the way, around the world. So, you know, it's an interesting phenomenon, this racialization of the language.
Well, thank you very much, David, especially for spending your Friday evening with us. And
I have no life.
Well, still, we appreciate it. Thank you for speaking with us. If anyone wants, yeah, I could do your virtual applause.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and our next Socio Lunch is in April, on April 23rd. And so check your email for information about that to sign up. We'll be sending out an abstract for that soon.